either she was going to get the email, so maybe tell her after the. Is she called in? She's called in. Yeah, she's on the line.
Oh. New person that was
Frida.
on the list. Is that on her name?
Nope, this is Debbie.
Oh, yeah, but she was on the list on the press release?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
One second, I'll see this.
Okay.
We're going to get started in a second.
When I got it, I was like,
Sit on
I'm
it.
coming
Am
to
I
this
missing?
espresso. And I'll talk about how it's not meaningful to have your rights recognized when you wait 7 years and you still don't get a response. And what is the national instruction to police?
And also because it's systemic, right? It won't be misconduct.
Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to the press conference that we're having today. I'm going to ask if everyone who's on the phone line could please mute your phone unless you are speaking. There will be a portion after we hear from the speakers. We'll hear some questions from media in the room, and then we'll go to the any questions on the phone at that time. But so if you're calling in and you're on the phone and you're a media person or have a question, please do stay on mute until that portion of the press conference. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that, of course, we're on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and we are very grateful to them for being able to carry out our work today and to be in their beautiful territories. So wanting to acknowledge that as the offset. So we have quite a full press conference today. We've got 7 speakers. And so we're going to go through each of the speakers, and then we will go to the questions from the floor and then questions on the line. I'd like to welcome our first speaker today, who's Dali Alexis Nikal from the Wet'suwet'en Gidimt'en clan and one of the complainants to the CRCC.
I start off traditionally by saying Denise Tsakaze Skyze, and I will say that because I know that my chiefs and my community members are watching. Saisuzi Dali, Wet'suwet'en Gidimt'en Kasya Kazli. I'm Dali, I'm Wet'suwet'en, I'm from Gidimt'en clan, and I come from Kasyak territory, which is Grizzly House. It's the same territories that were raided last year by militarized police forces, and we're still seeing those same forces out on our Yinta. I was one of the original complainants due to the fact that I was making a trip back with a number of food and emergency supplies packed in my vehicle to bring out to our trading post, which was at kilometer 39. And I got news that there was a police roadblock put up and that they weren't letting people through. I checked on the RCMP website, and on the site it said that they would allow people through to bring food and emergency supplies out to the people out there. When I got out there, I was denied access, and the police officer who I dealt with couldn't really give me a good reason as to why. He just said that he wasn't he hadn't actually read the press release, and then he stated that there were a number of half-cut trees all over. At which point I asked him if he had seen the trees, and he said no. And so they held us there and didn't allow us to bring out food and the supplies such as hand warmers, foot warmers, winter gear. And at that time, I'd like to remind everybody that it was minus 38, I believe. So it was pretty important that I got it out there. This has been an ongoing issue, obviously, since last year. It's been really disheartening, to say the least, because they're human rights violations that are occurring. And the excessive force used by the police in last year's raid has really put a fear into a lot of the Wet'suwet'en community members. We have elders out there that are scared to go out to their own territories that they were raised on. 80-year-old elders that have lived out on the Yinta their entire lives. And they know that the RCMP are just there to basically escort CGL in, which is also incredibly hard because the destruction that's incurred to our territories is devastating for a lot of people. In Wet'suwet'en territory, we've had a pretty long history of poor treatment by the RCMP. So that adds to the nervousness and the fear for a lot of the people. We are right in the middle of the Highway of Tears, and we've seen so many of our young women go missing and it not being taken seriously by the RCMP. My cousin Cecilia went missing when I was 11. My cousin Delphine went missing when I was 12. My friend Ramona, who I went to camp with and played ball with, went missing when I was 16. My foster sister Danielle, who lived up there with me, went missing here. My cousin Frances went missing about 3 years ago. Jessica Patrick went missing about 2 years ago, a year and a half, I guess. And none of those young women there are no answers for the reasons that they went missing. There are no perpetrators that have been found, and yet we can see militarized forces out on our territories keeping us from our own land, from land that our ancestors took care of. And I say since time immemorial, but I think it's so overused. A lot of my older relatives and a lot of the history that I've heard, they say the beginning of time. They say this is where we started, that we came from the land. So it's incredibly disheartening, and it's even more so that it seems like there are still no answers for why we're being kept off our Yinta or why they need such huge forces out there. Nobody out there has weapons, and I sat behind Cody as he was questioned by a police officer, and the police officer said, at the end of the day, we all just want to go home safe. I'd really hate it if I had to hurt one of you. And it was heartbreaking because that's where Cody lives. That's Molly's husband. They live out there and they can't go home. The Yinta is our home, and we can't go there and feel safe because we know of the excessive force that could be used if we try to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to the phone now, so only if you're Molly Wickham, unmute your phone. Otherwise, everyone else on the phone, please stay muted so we can enjoy hearing from our next speaker, who is Molly Wickham Slado, Wet'suwet'en Gidimt'en Clan spokesperson. So Molly, we'll turn to you, and because of the large number of speakers we have today, we are going to try to keep the speakers to 5 minutes if possible. Thank you.
Masai, Denise, Takaise, Skyse, Saislado, Sydney, Gidimden, Hesley, This is Molly Wickham. My traditional name is Slado. I just want to start off by thanking the Coast Salish and the people there of those lands for hosting this event. BCCL, UBCIC, all of the speakers that are there today, my sister Dalee and Takaya Blaney, and really want to highlight the amazing work that the Indigenous youth have been putting into supporting us, and want to take this opportunity to just recognize everything that's been going on and all of the work that you've been doing, the commitment to our struggle and to, you know, this unwavering support. I just want to say that we see you and we appreciate you more than we could ever express in words. I just want to give you a brief update on what's going on here with the exclusion zone and the checkpoint. So we have been prevented from accessing our territory. Dalee had mentioned and provided a backgrounder on what it was like, what it has been like in our territory with the RCMP presence. I've been prevented from accessing my civic residence for a period of time, criminalized as Wet'suwet'en, while non-Wet'suwet'en were allowed to access our territory freely. When they had the blockade, the RCMP blockade at 4 kilometer, while our territories were being invaded, all of our hereditary chiefs and all of our membership and all of our Wet'suwet'en people were prevented from accessing our territory. They were prevented from accessing our territory while our people had guns pointed at them, had sniper rifles pointed at them. And while non-Wet'suwet'en people and other residents of the area were allowed to freely go and access their homes, were freely allowed to go and access our territory, to go ice fishing, to harvest firewood, and to do whatever it was that they felt free to do on our lands. I want to address the fact that the exclusion zone is now down. However, people need to be aware of the fact that the RCMP continue to target and harass our Wet'suwet'en people and our guests. They continue to act disproportionately to their said goal of public safety, and they continue to arbitrarily and unlawfully detain and arrest people on our territory. We had an incident just yesterday where one person was threatened with arrest and detained for getting firewood for one of our camps. There was another incident where a supporter was arrested, targeted, followed by the RCMP from the territory, and then illegally arrested for, they claim, having not had proper documentation to be in Canada, to have crossed the border after they've given the RCMP their Canadian driver's license and passport. These are just a couple of examples of what we've been dealing with on a continuous basis. So although the exclusion zone is down, although the checkpoint is down, the RCMP continue to monitor and heavily surveil our people coming into our camps, coming into our homes, shining lights into our faces, identifying and surveilling and recording information about every single person that comes and goes from our territory. I want to also address, just for a moment, I know it's going to come up, and I want to just make one short statement about the announcement this morning from Bill Blair about the RCMP having met our conditions and that the barricades should come down. The RCMP clearly have not yet vacated or officially engaged with our hereditary chiefs, with our government. Respectfully, our chiefs and our clans require full engagement on this issue immediately, and it's suspicious to me that government and RCMP would publicly state that they've met our conditions without having spoken to our hereditary leadership, to our traditional governance. It feels a lot like a media strategy in an attempt to diffuse the direct action from coast to coast that we've been seeing in support and solidarity of the Wet'suwet'en people. The CISO office, the Community Industry Safety Office that is illegally occupying Gidimt'en territory was never permitted to be there. They've engaged in very gross abuse of power on our territories for the last year. And these complaints have come out, since the attack on Wet'suwet'en territory started again. But this has been an ongoing issue for us for the past year and continues to be an ongoing issue every single day out on our territory. And so to say that the office would be moved and that the conditions are met, I think is overreaching and overstepping, and especially indicative of the fact that they haven't actually talked to our traditional governance, our leaders, and had that discussion, and are prematurely attempting to diffuse any sort of direct action all across the country. It's disrespectful. It's not the way that our government works. It's not the way that we have relationships with one another and with nation to nation. And I encourage, everybody to continue to support the Wet'suwet'en in all of the ways that they have been until this issue is addressed by our hereditary chiefs and our clan members. Awatsa, Masai.
Mute your handset until we go to the question portion of the press conference. We'll go to Harsha Walia now, who's the Executive Director of the BC Civil Liberties Association.
Thank you all for being here today. I also want to start by acknowledging we're on unceded Coast Salish territories, the lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people, and give my thanks for being here on their lands. I also want to send my greetings to all the Wet'suwet'en people who are watching in, Sister Sledo, who just spoke, and all the hereditary chiefs who I know are watching from out east right now. I want to start by saying that BCCLA, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, which is the country's oldest and largest civil liberties and human rights organization, stands in full support of the Wet'suwet'en. We affirm Wet'suwet'en jurisdiction, Wet'suwet'en governance, and the stance of the hereditary chiefs in protecting their yinta, and all of the actions that they've taken in accordance with their governance system and their laws. I'm speaking here specifically about the complaint. That's what my comments are going to be focused on here today. The complaint that we made to the CRCC chairperson. So last month on January 29th, and then in an urgent follow-up letter that was also issued on February 9th, Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, the BCCLA, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs filed a complaint to the chairperson of the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP. The CRCC is an independent civilian oversight body over the RCMP. In our letters, we urged the CRCC chairperson to launch a chairperson-initiated complaint and public interest investigation regarding the improper and unlawful actions of the RCMP in implementing and enforcing a checkpoint and exclusion zone in Wet'suwet'en territory. So I want to be speaking today about the response that we received to our complaint. So first I want to thank Chairperson Michelaine Lahaie for very promptly, really quite unprecedented, responding to us within a matter of few weeks, and for acknowledging that the issues that were raised were actually of significant public interest. We know that people across the country are very closely watching the events that are unfolding in Wet'suwet'en territory. So to let people know what they can find in the complaints or in the response to the complaint, media has copies of it. There will be copies of it also available on our website shortly after this press conference. The chairperson of the CRCC has decided not to initiate a public interest investigation at this time. But I want to emphasize, not because it is not an issue of significant importance, but on the contrary, the chairperson does not want to delay the matter further by conducting an extensive process at this time, because these issues have already been raised with the RCMP. So in brief, a range of issues regarding enforcement of injunctions, use of arrest powers, the role of RCMP in policing Indigenous land defenders, access restrictions, exclusion zones, and stop checks were raised in an interim, not yet public report with 37 findings from the CRCC to the RCMP regarding the RCMP's response to anti-shale gas land offenders in Mi'kma'ki territories in New Brunswick in 2013. This interim report by the Commission is not public because the Commission is waiting for a response from the RCMP Commissioner, and this interim report has been sitting with the RCMP Commissioner since March 2019. So that has been 1 year that this interim report regarding Kent County, what's called the Kent County report, has been sitting with the RCMP Commissioner for 1 year with a number of key findings that have not yet been public, but the chairperson has now released a summary of these findings to us, given the significance of the issues raised and the similarities of the issues raised. So as I said, the letter will be public on our website, but I will say in brief what the Commission did find, and that the Commission that applies in our interpretation to what's happening in Wet'suwet'en territory. The Commission found there was no legal authority to require passengers to produce identification at stop checks. The Commission has found there is no legal authority for RCMP to conduct stop checks for the purposes of information gathering. The Commission has found that the concern for public safety that is stated is related to unconfirmed information that is not sufficient to justify an RCMP roadblock. The Commission has found that routine searches of vehicles and individuals conducted by RCMP were not authorized by law. The Commission has found that buffer zones or exclusion zones are only justifiable in specific limited circumstances and with the least interference to individual liberties. Anything outside of those bounds is legally impermissible. The Commission has found that certain arrests were made based on misinterpretations of the conditions of the injunction and that RCMP officers must have detailed and accurate interpretations of injunctions. The RCMP Act requires the RCMP to take action on the Commission's interim report findings. And again, this is in the Kent County matter. What is incredibly disturbing about this letter from the chairperson is that, again, the RCMP has been aware of these very same issues since March 2019. This was 1 full year ago. And of course, what happened was in 2013, so we're looking at 7 years. 7 years where people in Mi'kma'ki have been waiting for justice. And I should say that people in Mi'kma'ki do not actually have access to this report yet because it is not yet public. These summary findings were released to us on this matter. And the RCMP, we see, has continued to engage in the very similar pattern of unlawful policing operations in Wet'suwet'en territories. It is clear, given everything that the Wet'suwet'en people have said, and now we see that the RCMP commissioner has alluded to in their letter, that the RCMP has granted itself unlawful, discretionary, and unjustified powers to set up and expand an exclusion zone, to arrest people within the exclusion zone who are not actually in breach of the injunction, and they have unreasonably stopped and checked passengers and searched vehicles. There is absolutely no legal precedent nor established legal authority for such an overbroad policing power. Simply put, RCMP operations in Wet'suwet'en territories have been unlawful. We've also received information that the RCMP are continuing to stop check people, particularly at the 27-kilometer mark. Slato referred to some of this. Despite the fact that the exclusion zone has been lifted and the area is outside the injunction zone, the RCMP are still stopping passengers in vehicles and demanding identification and recording this information. In at least one instance, one person has been arrested. This was yesterday. This demonstrates an ongoing pattern of completely unjustified and unlawful authority. We would not tolerate police stopping and checking people in our own neighborhoods, searching our vehicles for 5 weeks. This is how long this has been going on, and denying us access to our homes as Wet'suwet'en people have been denied access to their yinta. We should not accept this happening on Wet'suwet'en lands. There has been much talk lately about the rule of law. I want to make clear here that the RCMP operations and RCMP blockades in Wet'suwet'en territory are an affront to the rule of law. This isn't a die-hard thriller. This is not a crime action movie. This is a really serious matter where Wet'suwet'en lives are at stake and Wet'suwet'en jurisdiction is at stake. It is completely unacceptable that the RCMP would engage in a pattern of targeted harassment and criminalization of Wet'suwet'en people and their invited guests on Wet'suwet'en lands, despite knowing that a number of similar police operations have been found by the CRCC in its interim report to be unlawful. They have known this again for 1 year. This constitutes a serious violation of Indigenous rights and jurisdiction, a severe deprivation of individual liberty interests, and an egregious impairment of charter-protected rights. And it is imperative that all people on these lands stand with the Wet'suwet'en when they say that the RCMP do not have the lawful jurisdiction to be on their territories. And as BCCLA, we stand with the Wet'suwet'en in affirming that the RCMP must immediately leave their territories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha. We're next going to hear from Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond Queequeg, who's the director of UBC's Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, professor at UBC Allard School of Law, served as provincial court judge for 20 years, and additionally is the former representative for children and youth in British Columbia. So we'll go to Mary Ellen for comment.
Good morning. I too would like to begin by recognizing and thanking the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people for sharing their territory with us. And I'd like to thank the Union of BC Indian Chiefs for hosting this event, and I'm very pleased to be here. I bring to this issue perspective with respect to the fundamental human rights of First Nations people to live on their land, to defend their land rights, to have freedom of expression, and to have personal and physical safety and cultural safety. These are very significant issues. Certainly in my role as director of the Residential School History and Dialogue Center, where we work hard to bring to life the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The history of the police engaging with First Nations people has a long and often very troubled history, including back to that time of residential school, when the police were used to forcibly remove children from their families, and in many instances, charge and punish parents for standing up and trying to stop that. Issues respecting human rights of First Nations people in Canada are issues of utmost national importance. And I'm pleased to be here today because I think the letter that has come back with respect to these complaints from the Commissioner of the Police Oversight Commission is actually a shocking letter. It's troubling on a number of fronts. Issues today of policing of First Nations people who are standing up to insist that their rights are being addressed. The policing of First Nations and others has to be looked at very carefully. Hence, it is shocking that the Police Complaints Commissioner has written a 9-page letter in response. And in that 9-page letter, she points out that she has done a thorough investigation of the circumstance that started in 2013 in New Brunswick with the anti-shale gas stand that was taken by the Mi'kmaq and other people, and their complaints, including 21 individual complaints that they took. That's in 2013. Today is 2017. 7 years later, for the first time in this letter, the Commissioner has said, I want to inform you, the complainants, and the public of the issues that I have raised in this report on the anti-shale protest complaints. And to my knowledge, this is the first time publicly that the Commissioner has released this. And obviously, she has determined that it is unacceptable for the RCMP, to whom she submitted her report a year ago about these matters, to sit and not respond. She says she's heard nothing back from them. She's addressed in the letter today, the 8-page letter, fundamental issues around how police need to conduct themselves. And some of them have already been outlined, but I want to emphasize a few of them. As was said earlier, routine searches of vehicles and individuals entering what are called protest camps or land defender sites were not authorized by law. Injunctions that are obtained by courts in Canada have restrictions and limits. They're not unlimited. RCMP must only respond according to law and follow the rule of law, something we've bandied about quite a bit recently, without precision. The oversight body for the RCMP has said that they have conducted and produced an over 100-page report on the behavior of the RCMP in previous situations. And she has said this is directly applicable to the situation here. And perhaps imminently across Canada, there will be efforts to dismantle or take down other instances where there are First Nations people standing up to defend their rights or standing up in alliance with the Wet'suwet'en people. It is extremely important in a matter of national interest that policing practice be clarified so that the rights of First Nations people are respected. The indication we have from the letter that has been released is that there are issues of national importance that are not being addressed by the RCMP. It is not acceptable that the RCMP for more than a year not respond to a report of this magnitude. It is also not acceptable, given the history of Crown relationships with First Nations and police relationship with First Nations, that if a First Nations person is to take a complaint about their treatment by the police, as has been done here, that they wait 7 or 8 years for a response. If you wait 7 or 8 years for a response to a complaint and the commission finds that in fact your rights were violated, that it was an illegal search, it was an excessive police act, is it a meaningful thing to find that out 7 years later? It is not meaningful, it is not timely, it is not appropriate. It is extremely important that there be clarity about what are buffer zones, what are exclusion zones, whether or not a broad-based police effort on the ground in First Nations territories is justified. And the commissioner has said very clearly that instances where they're blocking public access to roadways, hindering the media's access to those places, that those are not reasonable, and that steps have to be reasonable. And as the commissioner says in her letter, there are limits in a free and democratic society on what the police can do with everyone, but there are special circumstances for First Nations people, and that requires clarity. I would just like to say and add my voice to the concerns here today that the commissioner has articulated recommendations. She identifies that she has produced a report that has multiple recommendations for improvement with respect to the conduct of the police with First Nations. She made in the previous report 37 findings and 12 recommendations. When these recommendations are made, and she says clearly in her letter that these include fundamental issues like how RCMP policies are constructed, what kind of procedures they use, what kind of training they have. If we've waited 7 years and have had no insight into that, it's a deep concern. And although I'm speaking today about this issue for the RCMP, which as we know has the policing contract entered into by the government of British Columbia for this province, the comments of the commissioner and what is in the report, which in fact we haven't seen, although she's alluded to here, the details of that are of pressing importance for municipal police forces, for provincial police forces, and for RCMP everywhere. They're also of pressing importance for people like the Mohawk peacekeepers who may be called upon to dismantle a blockade. These are very significant national issues, and while the commissioner has said she doesn't feel at this point that she needs to trod that ground again, the fact is, as the public and as those who are concerned about the human rights of First Nations people, the fact that we have not seen that report, we do not know if there's RCMP learning from the report, and we've not seen the RCMP response, is a very significant issue. And in terms of the safety of First Nations people and their human rights throughout Canada, including in Wet'suwet'en territory, these are massively important issues, and they need clarity, and they are urgent issues in British Columbia, and they are urgent issues in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Our next speaker is Takaya Blaney, who's here with Indigenous Youth for Wet'suwet'en. Takaya?
Hello, My name is Takaya Blaney. I am 19. I'm from the Tla'amin Nation, and I'm an Indigenous youth that stands in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en. I would first and foremost like to extend my respects to the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, matriarchs, and peoples. Victory for Wet'suwet'en is a victory for us all, and so as youth, we stand with you. As Indigenous youth, we are inheriting a gigantic colonial legacy of genocide, colonization, and gendered violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, in which there's direct linkages between that and extractive industry projects like the Coastal GasLink pipeline. We call upon Canada, Canadian politicians, John Horgan, Justin Trudeau, and all levels of settler governance to betray that legacy and to move forward in good faith in negotiations with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leadership to dignify their leadership by being accountable to the demands that they have set out, because good faith negotiations cannot come under the conditions of a military occupation. Last week, Indigenous youth for Wet'suwet'en peacefully occupied the ceremonial entrance of the BC Legislature building, and for the first time in Canadian history, interrupted the gross display of colonial pageantry of that entrance for the throne speech, laying out the red carpet for the Lieutenant Governor to celebrate the military occupation of Canada. Meanwhile, Indigenous matriarchs had just been forcibly removed from their own territories, their protocols and their ceremony desecrated by Canada. While that was happening, Indigenous youth were occupying Dan Vandal's office in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Minister of Northern Affairs. And for the 2 weeks prior to that, there had been occupations by Indigenous youth of ministry offices across the country. The military invasion, taking Indigenous lands at gunpoint, aerial surveillance, intimidating leaders in their own homelands, and doing so with a piece of paper, with an injunction that has no authority over unceded traditional lands. It's not an isolated incident, as we see from this report. RCMP have a long legacy of terrorizing and going beyond their jurisdiction to assist industry and exploiting Indigenous lands. And we, as Indigenous youth in these cities across the country, are facing similar criminalization from injunctions, like the one recently set out in Victoria that says that we're not allowed to protest in any area that's habitually frequented by any members of government. The scope of that is so broad. It's unconstitutional. As Indigenous people anywhere, we should not be barred from peacefully occupying Indigenous lands. So we hold Canada accountable, because we know that when government makes announcements that they're going to withdraw RCMP without having even consulted with Wet'suwet'en hereditary leadership, it's a performative media strategy. And as an Indigenous youth, we know that we cannot rely on promises that have been broken time and time again. As an Indigenous youth, I was a child when reconciliation was emerging into our public vocabulary, and I watched it die. I watched it die when Wet'suwet'en lands were raided and matriarchs were arrested. And so we declare as Indigenous youth that reconciliation is dead, and we hold Canada accountable to go beyond a performance in their commitment to uphold Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty. And we will continue to peacefully occupy spaces and demand that Coastal GasLink and RCMP are fully withdrawn from Wet'suwet'en territories, that good faith negotiations that don't rely on coercion are prioritized by Canada, because this sets a shameful precedent. Canada's behavior towards Wet'suwet'en and towards Indigenous people nationally who stand in solidarity with them sets a shameful precedent. But once again, a victory for Wet'suwet'en is a victory for us all, and so I would just like to raise my hands to Wet'suwet'en peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Takaya. Our next speaker is Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, the President of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs.
Waihaskahul, Pisnaksil, Esquis Asiut. I want to begin by acknowledging the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam peoples, on whose territory we have the privilege of gathering here this morning. I would also like to convey our warmest greetings to the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leadership, to the matriarchs, and in particular to the Indigenous youth across Turtle Island who have stood in complete and solid solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people and have forcefully spoken out against the paramilitary tactics of the RCMP, the occupation forces that are taking place in Wet'suwet'en territory, and the shameful and disgusting fact that the RCMP actions are very mercenary in nature, acting on behalf of Coastal GasLink, as opposed to protecting the broad interests of all parties involved in these very, very volatile issues. The report that has been released is absolutely explosive, it's shocking, and again, incredibly shameful in today's world of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We are at a crossroads in this country in regard to what this all represents. And we need to move out of the colonial, neo-colonial shadow of the notion of exploiting the land and commodifying the land, as opposed to caretaking and stewardship of the, this beautiful place that we describe as Canada and British Columbia. And we need to understand that the UN Declaration is of utmost importance in terms of what it represents to bring forward Indigenous law and Indigenous legal institutions to stand alongside the other systems of law that exist in this country. It is not a case of colonial law superseding Indigenous law or Indigenous institutions. Indigenous law is enshrined in our languages, in our Indigenous languages. It's enshrined in our culture and traditions. It's taught to our children at the very youngest age, and that is our responsibilities to Mother Earth, to the lands and the waters. And Indigenous people are simply carrying out our own laws and our own traditions as we are taught by our knowledge keepers. And to have those activities criminalized by governments and by the RCMP and suffer the brutal repression that we've witnessed time and time again in this country is absolutely unacceptable. I want to hold my hands up to the Indigenous youth across this country, and I speak of all youth who have so courageously stood on principle and have expressed their total rejection of what has been going on for too long, that represents the legacy of the colonial, neo-colonial foundations of this country. And again, I say we are at a crossroads where we need to redefine what this country stands for. And I would like to remind all of us that we're on the doorstep of the TMX issue, which will be equally volatile and explosive as the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And, you know, we haven't seen any type of leadership emanating from Ottawa with respect to Trudeau and his international gallivanting around the globe, ironically seeking a place on the UN Security Council. And we have John Horgan in his arrogance refusing to honor the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leadership with his presence and to meet. So we call on the governments, and I agree with Jody Wilson-Raybould where she suggested that Prime Minister Trudeau hop on a plane, pick up Premier Horgan and go to Smithers and meet with the hereditary leaders. This is going to be a very protracted, volatile, intense days ahead. So I want to thank everybody for being here this morning.
Thank you, Grand Chief. Our last speaker is David Suzuki. Everyone knows him. Broadcaster, co-founder of David Suzuki Foundation, recipient of the Order of Canada, and repeatedly voted one of Canada's most trusted people. So let's hear what he has to
That
say.
was a few years ago. Thank you. I do want to thank the Musqueams, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people for having cared for these lands for so long that we're now sitting in. I know that you guys all want a 20-second clip but that's not about what I'm going to give you today, I'm afraid. All Canadians, but especially politicians who we elect to lead us and protect us, protect our future, should be grateful to the people at the Unistoten camp and the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who support them. This is not, to me, about pipelines or jobs or the economy. It's, as Chief Stewart says, it's about how we live on this planet and what matters most. Today, our society and government are driven by a corporate agenda, which is to keep the economy and profits growing above all else. Canada is a nation built on extraction of forests, minerals, fish, fossil fuels, as well as air, water, and soil. But in our exploitation of these resources, there has been no responsibility to protect and ensure them for future generations. This has to end because this attitude has driven us into a human-induced period of mass extinction and climate change that now threatens the very future for our children. For the biosphere to continue to be productive for future generations, we must move to a profoundly different path built on a recognition of and gratitude for nature's generosity, and acknowledge then our responsibility to protect and nurture the natural world which gives us our lives and livelihood. Wet'suwet'en people, like Indigenous people around the world who cling to their cultural values, offer a perspective on our relationship with the land that the rest of us desperately need at this moment. Let me explain why this is so urgent and why people are now driven to acts of civil disobedience. In 1962, an environmental movement was inspired by Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, about the dangers of chemical pesticides. Scientists had known at this time about the warming effect of greenhouse gases since 1824. And for more than 100 years of research, the basics of global warming were well understood. That's why in 1965, Frank Icard, the president of the American Petroleum Institute, which is the American counterpart to CAP, stated, and I quote, "There is still time to save the world's people from the catastrophic consequence of pollution, but time is running out. Carbon dioxide is being added to Earth's atmosphere by the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas at such a rate that by the year 2000, the heat balance will be so modified as possibly to cause changes in climate beyond local or even national efforts. 1965. In 1970, the first Earth Day was held. In 1977, James Black, the lead scientist for Exxon, reported, "There is general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is affecting the global climate is through carbon dioxide from the release of burning of fossil fuels." And 5 years later, Exxon scientists concluded heading off potentially catastrophic events would, quote, require major reductions in fossil fuel combustion. In 1987, the United Nations-sponsored Brundtland Commission report was published as Our Common Future, in which it stated that Indigenous people, quote, are the repositories of vast accumulations of traditional knowledge and experience. Their disappearance is a loss for the larger society, which could learn a great deal from their traditional skills in sustainably managing very complex ecological systems. In 1988, a major conference on climate was held in Toronto, attended by scientists and delegates from 46 countries, including 26 state ministers. It was opened by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, followed by the Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and then climatologist James Hansen, who stated that he was 99% sure the heat wave in North America that year was caused by human use of fossil fuels. The press release at the end of the conference stated, and I quote, "Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to global nuclear war," and called for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 15 years. If that target had been adopted and achieved, we would have saved billions of dollars while avoiding today's climate crisis. In 1992, 1,600 senior scientists from 71 countries, including more than half of all Nobel Prize winners, signed the World Scientist Warning to Humanity, which stated, quote, "Human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future we wish for human society and the plant and animal kingdoms. Fundamental changes are urgent if we are to avoid the collision our present course will bring about." End of quote. It then went on to list the areas of collision, beginning with the atmosphere and ending with species extinction, and concluded, again, quote, "No more than one or a few decades remain before the chance to avert the threats we now confront will be lost. A great change in our stewardship of the earth and life on it is required." 25 years later, in 2017, more than 16,000 scientists signed a second warning to humanity, even more alarming and urgent than the first. In 1992, at the Earth Summit in Rio, delegates adopted a goal of stabilizing 1990 levels of emissions by 2000, which Canada signed, yet did nothing to achieve it. In 1997 at Kyoto, the industrialized countries that created the problem of climate change agreed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5 to 6% below 1990 levels by 2010. In 2001, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien ratified the Kyoto Protocol. Then, newly elected Prime Minister Stephen Harper changed the baseline from 1990 to 2005, and then pulled Canada out of Kyoto altogether in 2006, making Canada the only country to back out of the agreement. By 1998, the American Petroleum Institute's position had changed to, quote, "It's not known for sure whether A, climate change is actually occurring, and B, if it is, whether humans really are responsible for it." In 2015, Justin Trudeau was elected Prime Minister, announced Canada is back, attended the Paris conference, and signed the pledge to keep temperature rising by more than 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And now we had with that a carbon budget. That is, we know if we're going to keep the limit to that temperature rise, how much carbon we can add to the atmosphere. Yet in 2018, Trudeau bought the Kinder Morgan pipeline to transfer diluted bitumen, a corrosive mix from the tar sands of Alberta, to Vancouver's port. In October 2018, an IPCC special report concluded a rise of more than 1.5 degrees beyond pre-industrial temperatures would be catastrophic and must be avoided by rapidly reducing emissions by 45% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. One day after the report was released, marijuana became legal in Canada and pushed everything else out of the media. In May 2019, a UN special report on biodiversity documented a mass extinction induced by humans that was putting 1 million species of plants and animals on the brink of vanishing. A day later, Harry and Meghan had a baby, and the only thing that went extinct was a report on extinction. The last parliamentary session declared Canada is in a state of climate emergency, yet the media do not reflect it. And this is why Greta Thunberg is saying, urgently demanding, listen to the scientists. And then I say, look to groups like those at the Unistoten camp for guidance into an uncertain future. The Unistoten camp did not spring up recently to block the pipeline. It was set up more than 5 years ago to revivify life on the land following traditional customs. And I was honored to visit it more than a year ago. The greatest impediment to finding solutions to issues of climate change and biodiversity loss is the mindset underlying the way we live and act. It's not the economy that gives us our lives. It is nature that provides clean air, water, soil, sunlight, and other living things. So we must assume the responsibility to protect and care for her. This is the context that I believe gives meaning to the Unistoten camp and all of those that are supporting that camp. I am here to pledge my support and to thank them and their hereditary leaders on behalf of all Canadians for standing firm so that all the rest of us can learn from them and apply the lessons we learn from them. Thank you.
We'll now go to questions from the room first, and then we'll go to the phones for questions at that time. Just a reminder again to please keep your phones on mute unless we are asking for phone questions. So are there any questions in the room? I'll come over with the microphone if so. Yeah.
Quiet up. My name's Arnie Jack. I'm from the Shuswap Nation here, and I have a question for, in general, that would be, there's a lot of discussion about the legal, and in 1998, Herb George came to Williams Lake, and I asked him, how long, when is the Delgamuukw team going to go back to court? And he said it would take us a minimum of 2 years at that time to go back to court. And I think that we would have been 20 years into Delgamuukw 2. And there was a lot of 5 years talk about the DISC, the Delgamuukw Implementation Strategic Committee after 97, that I don't think went anywhere. It never got us back on the land, and I just wanted to know that if there's plans for Delgamuukw 2, would that stop the RCMP? Once a writ is filed, would that stop them and show that they need to leave the territory? Because they do need to leave the territory for any peace to come about in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone that would like to take that question? I'm not sure. Mary Ellen? Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to say that I appreciate the question, because you're right that on Delgamuukw there are established rights of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en peoples in their territories that were recognized in the highest court in Canada, and that right includes something we call Aboriginal title, but also recognizing that they're a nation with their own laws, own practices, and own territories. And since that important watershed decision, there has been minimal progress to today. I can't speak about all of the processes that have been in place, but certainly can speak to the issue of impatience and also join forces with Grand Chief Stuart Phillip in lifting my hands up to young people who carefully pay attention to this, respect their leaders, who are speaking on behalf of rights and title holders in that territory with established rights. And the issue of policing in the territory is very significantly different than other places because there are established rights of First Nations peoples. And again, I would just say that the Police Complaints Commissioner that wrote back today acknowledges that in her letter, that police must take initiatives to understand and become educated about the rights of First Nations people, about the culture, the land, and knowledge about it before enforcing outside laws on them. So this is the stand-off position we are in Canada, is there's a lot of work has been done by the chiefs and leadership of Wet'suwet'en, and it has come to this point where the police need to, of course, retreat, but also need to become much more educated and respectful and supportive toward the rights of the Wet'suwet'en people, and of course toward the rights of all First Nations people in Canada, because it's important what the Wet'suwet'en people are doing, and it's important what the young people are doing to stand up and say it's taken far too long to address this properly. And clearly not another young generation will allow this to pass, like people of my generation who have been involved in this for more than 35 years and have seen very limited progress.
Thank you. We're also going to hear from Delee, and then we'll go to a next question.
I just wanted to say with Delgamuukw, when we didn't move on that, or when things didn't start happening right after, I think part of that is part of the reason is being understood and seen today. Like, the colonial system isn't working for us, and so even if we were to go back in and start discussions about implementation of our constitution and whatnot, it's still not being recognized. We've been out on those lands forever, and they recognize that portion in Delgamuukw. They used our hereditary chiefs as the witnesses, and they're not acknowledging that the hereditary chiefs are the authorities on those territories today. And we, at a very strategic time, we saw the provincial government put out a notice that they were entering into title talks with us. And it was right at the time that there were a number of actions set to happen all across Turtle Island. And they released this statement saying they're entering into title talks. And then we watched John Horgan come into our feast system. And while we have Collisette, one of our matriarchs, is standing at the front of the feast hall. She's standing talking, and he's sitting talking to Scott Fraser, not listening. And Nemox gets up and is explaining why we're collecting money for a spill. And John Horgan is up walking around. Tlatan from Unistoten is standing at the back where the high chiefs stand. And she's talking. And he's taking selfies with somebody. So, I mean, we've seen that no matter what we say, and when we talk about the possibilities of entering and engaging in more interactions or a relationship with the colonial system, it just hasn't been working, and it's very clear that there's a lack of respect. And so that's why it's so important for groups like our Indigenous youth, for all of our allies and supporters to be stepping up and saying that they're not going to sit back and allow this to keep on occurring.
I'll say one quick thing, Arnie, on that. And I don't know if people have seen this, but it's really important information. About 2 weeks ago, the Narwhal released a number of Freedom of Information requests that were a follow-up to Delgamuukw to see what the provincial government and federal government were doing. And those FOIs revealed that at the provincial level, a team was set up to follow up on Delgamuukw, and basically it was a seed and release and surrender team, where the provincial government and the federal government, instead of looking to Delgamuukw as a precedent set, a legal precedent at the Supreme Court of Canada to affirm rights and title, instead wanted to ensure economic certainty. This team was made up of corporate lobbyists and the provincial government and the federal government to basically ensure certainty for corporations, and a team that was set up to undermine Delgamuukw at the provincial and federal government level. So I think for reporters, it's really important to look at these FOIs, to look at the pattern that undermined the precedent set by Delgamuukw, and the very long pattern for, of course, much longer, but really since Delgamuukw, to enforce a cede, release, and surrender platform of conducting Indigenous rights and title talks and negotiations. And so this was at both the provincial and federal government levels, in the Aboriginal Affairs departments at both levels.
I only say this.
I'm just gonna, do you want one quick follow-up? Okay.
Yeah. Clearly that I only say this because there's been legal action recently that the chiefs have taken, and we have Don Ryan from the Gitxsan, and I know he's from a different nation, but he came to our territory and he said that don't bother with the injunctions, just start the Delgamuukw too. And I know that it was a different time then, because the chiefs of the Gitxsan and the Wet'suwet'en, it didn't look like they were ready to go back to court together. But I was there that day when the chiefs came across the bridge. I was there. And they said it was the first time that they'd ever come together like that. And since they are together, it would only make sense to start the writ today, to show the RCMP. Like, isn't that a feasible course of action? Like, it's only one course of action, but it's only something so simple that can be carried out with the writ, like what Delgamuukw did in Gujaw in 2002. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to a couple more questions on the floor. If possible, maybe direct your question to someone.
Hi, Amy Smart, Canadian Press. This is sort of a double question. One, given that it's been out there for a year, do you have any concerns about the power of this commission to compel any action? And two, there are a number of other findings in this letter. I'm wondering if you think they apply to this case too, such as that the police had reasonable grounds to arrest people for various offenses, the force used was necessary and proportional, and they understood and applied a measured approach.
Thank you. I'll probably go to Harsha or Mary Ellen.
Yeah, on the latter issue, I think the piece that applies is that the arrests that were made for breach of injunctions, those ones clearly did not apply. All of the arrests that were made in Wet'suwet'en territory, all of the charges are civil contempt charges. None of them are offenses that relate to the criminal code. In Mi'kma'ki, there was a range of offenses that people were charged with, but absolutely the piece that applies is the fact that the police did not understand the terms of the injunction, and that a number of arrests that were made for breach of injunction were actually made in areas where the injunction does not apply. The exclusion zone is far wider than the injunction zone, and we're seeing this play out in the courts right now in Smithers and Prince George with respect to these civil contempt charges for breach of injunction in areas where people actually were not breaching the injunction. So I think that's the relevant piece. And in terms of, the broader question about the powers of the CRCC, absolutely. It begs the question about what the power of the CRCC is. I mean, the chairperson has made it clear that they're waiting for the past 1 year to get a response from the RCMP commissioner. It's also clear that the RCMP, despite having this report for 1 year, do not seem to have changed their course of action when it comes to policing operations on Indigenous territories. And there is certainly an ongoing question about how effective the CRCC can actually be, if they can compel action or not. And the commissioner has made it very clear that the recommendations that they're making are remedial in nature. The RCMP are obligated under the RCMP Act to take action on them, but the CRCC cannot compel that action.
I would just add to that. I think this letter suggests that there's a very serious problem that the civilian oversight of the RCMP does not work. Mm-hmm. If it takes more than a year and they don't respond to the oversight body, we don't even know what these recommendations are. I can't say to you today that, they said that there was unnecessary arrests because the police in the New Brunswick situation didn't interpret the injunction properly. Well, this is exactly what we're facing in British Columbia and elsewhere right now, is how do you interpret the injunction? And how do you go forward? Not to mention the Police Complaints Commissioner said that there needs to be fundamental policy and other reform. Well, the Minister of Public Safety for Canada, is that good enough in Canada that we can have civilian oversight of the RCMP where it's really not oversight? Like, is it oversight if 7 years later you don't know what actually happened? So we're sitting here today, am I to say to people, well, we'll find out what happened with the Wet'suwet'en people in 2007. Like, it's how long is it going to take for this to occur? Like, it's just completely, I can't respond to the substance. I mean, the commissioner is saying on some issues the police force was reasonable. That's a positive thing. We all want the police to behave reasonably. But what's more telling is she sent a 9-page letter to the complainants assembled here to say, I have very serious problems and it's in the public interest for me to tell you what I told the RCMP, yet they haven't responded to. So the national issue here is that Wet'suwet'en people have exposed a fundamental issue. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry dove into this in depth and said there's a problem with civilian oversight. This is a systemic problem. So today the concern we have is we have no idea. I would like to see the 100-page report that they sent to the RCMP, not to mention those 20 plus people from New Brunswick who filed complaints. Maybe they would like to see the report from what happened in 2013. And, you know, justice delayed is justice denied. And today we're talking about urgent issues of justice for First Nations people. In the policing side, it throws it up into the air. Canada's oversight of policing is clearly inadequate for First Nations. Even the commissioner is essentially saying to us, I'm impotent to deal with this. Help me get the RCMP to respond. That's a very sad statement about the state of policing.
Thank you. I'll go to Melanie, and then one more question, Ian, and then we'll go to the phone.
We'll have two quick questions. One for Dali, just with your experience, your knowledge, your thoughts on the RCMP's announcement that they will leave your territory. And then Harsha, if you can just clarify afterwards, just what would the next step be with this complaint process, considering everything that you just talked about? Like, what else can you do with regards to that? But first, Dali, if you will.
In regards to the announcement that they'll leave the territory? Yeah. Oh, no, I know. I'm just saying it in disbelief because I do not believe it, and I won't believe it until literally they have moved out the CISO office. They have a surveillance camera with a huge floodlight at the bridge at 44 at the Ginnamden site. They're continuing to stop people not just out on the INTA and out on the territories, but in like municipal town limits. So it's incredibly hard to believe. Same with, it was just like last year when they said that they weren't coming in with extreme forces. We all saw what happened there, and they tried to stop media at that point. And it's incredibly, it's scary because they keep putting out this narrative that somehow they're just doing their job, or, you know, we're these crazy protesters. My 72-year-old mother was out there last year. She was out there because I couldn't be out there because I have 2 small aneurysms in my head, and everybody said, no, you're an Indigenous woman with a shaved head and you have a strong presence. If something happens, the police will target you. And I know that that's true. So instead, my 72-year-old mother went out and stood in my place, and she said, you know, I'm non-Indigenous. I'm a 72-year-old white woman. She said, if something happens to me, there's hell to pay. And that's an incredibly sad statement. And that was after they said that they weren't coming in with force. So we all know that I have to see it to believe it. I mean, right now, it is just a media strategy.
Thank you. Harsha, to the second question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the next steps are to be decided still between all the complainants. Of course, what the chairperson is suggesting is that this complaint go to the RCMP. There's very viable reasons that a number of complainants may decide that's not the route they want to go. But I think what's really important is the fact that this is coming to the public. This is not simply an issue of what the complainants will do within the process of the Complaints Commission or with respect to the RCMP. I think this is something that all Canadians need to be incredibly concerned about. This is something that Indigenous people have known for a very long time, that policing is a tool of colonization. This is something that Canadians need to understand that also, in addition to that, policing operations of land defenders in Wet'suwet'en territory are unlawful. And that it is, this is something that as a public, we need to take up because the powers to stop the RCMP are very minimal, short of people continuing to stand with the Wet'suwet'en in all the diverse ways that they've been doing so.
Thank you. We'll go for one more question from the floor. Okay. We'll do, I already had said to Ian, we'll do Ian and then Tina, and then we'll do one question from the phone, I think.
Just a quick question to Ms. Nakal, actually. What's your sense, what's your response to the CRCC report that's obviously the discussion here? I'm not sure we've heard, what do you think about this document that's brought us here today? And
I think that well, it feels like she's basically stating that it's an exercise in futility and that it just reiterates that there's been a consistent criminalization of Indigenous people. And I don't even like saying the terms land defenders and water protectors because it's Indigenous people occupying our own territories. You look at, Canahoos with the Squetmec and tiny house warriors. You look at Oka, people defending a tiny piece of land that had cultural and ceremonial significance, and they brought in the military. You look at Muskrat Falls. You look at Treaty Truck House, 3, elderly women that have been arrested. It's been ongoing. You look at Ipperwash, Dudley George being shot and killed, an unarmed youth being shot and killed. You look at our territories and Denzel, one of our Gixan neighbors, having a sniper rifle pointed at him. So they've known for years and years that this has been an ongoing issue, and nothing's being done about it, and it feels like there's a real powerlessness to this whole system or this process.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Tina for a question, and then we'll go to the phone after that.
Thank you. I've heard of many Indigenous people, land defenders out there right now at many of the blockades, saying that this is, in a sense, fueling the racism that many Indigenous people face. An example of that is many of the mainstream media have stated that CN Rail is now laying off 450 workers because of these pipeline protests, but yet 3 months ago, they actually announced those same layoffs. So what would you like to say to Canadians at this point where they're basically relaying this to racism and fueling that whole story that many Indigenous people have faced over the years?
Thank you. Are there any people left on the phone that wanted to ask a question? We probably have time for one question.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, go for it.
Yes, my name is Hélène Buzeri. I'm with the newspaper Le Devoir in Montreal. My question is directed to Molly Wickham. I don't know if she's still on the phone there. I just wanted to have an indication. The RCMP indicate that they're willing to get out of the Wet'suwet'en territory. So I wanted to know if you consider this to be enough to lift the blockades. And in the same vein, I know that the hereditary chiefs are on meeting with the Mohawks leadership. So I wanted to know what's the message that they are conveying. Is that to stop the blockades or to continue? And I have a follow-up after that.
We might not have time for your follow-up, unfortunately. So if you wanted to just say everything now, we probably won't have time for follow-up.
Oh, okay. So I just wanted to know if you will have time to meet with the ministers. They're trying to set up a meeting, but it seems to be difficult. So what's barring for a meeting? What's the problem?
Thank you. Molly, and then if you could go on mute. And then Molly, if you're still on the line, are you able to, did you hear the question? Are you able to provide response? Otherwise, we can go here in the room probably.
Yep. So the first question regarding the RCMP, we would have to see what the details of the offer are. Like I said this morning, they announced it publicly without talking to the hereditary chiefs. And so the hereditary chiefs need an opportunity to respond to what the details of the demands are. The demands have been very clear that the RCMP need to remove themselves from the territory, including the illegal detachment on Gidimt'en territory. And so that doesn't mean just move the detachment somewhere close by and continue on with the same harassment. That means remove themselves from our territory altogether. and without conditions. And so one of the indications was that if we allow CGL onto the territory, that the CISO office would be moved. And the other condition that the hereditary chiefs had was that CGL delay and temporarily stop any construction activities while discussions were going on. So the chiefs have been very clear. Levels of government haven't come to the table with anything significant. They've been calling chiefs individually, which is not how we do business. We did do business by talking collectively about the issues. And so until that happens, we're in the same position. And, Wet'suwet'en are not in a position to tell any other nation that they need to stand down. And it's been clear and clearly communicated what the demands are for the Wet'suwet'en and for other nations who are standing in solidarity, that they will not stand down until these conditions have been met. And so far, even with the announcement this morning, it doesn't seem like those conditions are being met. And it's up to the chiefs to respond to that directly.
And how come there's no meeting? What's the holdup?
The meeting that the chiefs will, the hereditary leadership won't meet with the government until until those conditions are met. They have not contacted, Bill Blair has not contacted the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief to talk about the statement that he made this morning.
Okay, thank you very much, Molly. Do we have one last question from the phone from a different caller at all? Okay, well then we will end the press conference. Thank you everyone for coming.